The portrait arrived at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in April, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had been knotted twice, as though the sender wanted to ensure it would not come undone in transit. Margaret Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, set down her teacup and studied the parcel where it rested against the silver coffee service, her painter's eye noting the dimensions before her heart registered what the dimensions might contain. The footman who had brought it stood by the door with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting to be dismissed, and Margaret gestured for him to leave the room before she reached for the string. Her fingers worked the knots methodically, not rushing, because rushing would mean she already knew what this was and had assigned it an emotional register. And she had learned long ago that the first response to any composition should be assessment, not reaction. The paper fell away. The portrait leaned against the coffee pot, still facing her, and Margaret tilted it toward the window where the morning light came in at an angle that would reveal the brushwork. The painting was competently executed. Margaret registered that first. The artist was Jonathan Haywood, whose work she recognized from the controlled use of shadow and the particular way he rendered fabric in motion. The subject was her husband, Richard Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth. Seated in a chair she did not recognize, in a room she had never entered. His posture was formal, his expression composed, his left hand resting on the arm of the chair in a position that suggested authority without arrogance. Beside him, standing with one hand on the back of his chair, was a woman Margaret had never met, but whose identity required no introduction. Lady Serena Drake, widow of the late Viscount Drake, wore a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light in a way that suggested Haywood had spent considerable time on the folds. Her hand rested on Richard's shoulder, not possessively, companionably, as though she belonged there. Margaret set the portrait flat on the table and studied it the way her father had taught her to study any commissioned work. She ignored the subjects and examined the craft. The lighting was uneven. Haywood had positioned a lamp to Richard's left to create drama, but the result was that Richard's jaw sat in shadow when his natural bone structure would have been better served by light from the right. The composition placed Serena too far back, making her appear secondary when the entire purpose of the portrait was clearly to assert her presence. The background was a library, but the books on the shelves were rendered with such vague brushwork that they became decorative rather than specific, which meant Haywood had run out of time or interest. Margaret tilted the portrait again, checking the signature in the lower right corner. Haywood's mark was there, small and precise, dated 3 weeks prior. The door to the morning room opened, and William toddled in with his nurse behind him. He was 2 years old, round-faced and sturdy, and he made directly for Margaret's chair the way he always did in the mornings when he was brought down before being taken to the nursery for breakfast. Margaret turned the portrait face down on the table before he reached her. William climbed into her lap, his small hands gripping the edge of the table for balance, and he pointed at the back of the canvas where it now rested against the coffee service. William said, "Papa?" Margaret's hand stilled on his back. "No, darling, not now." He repeated, "Papa," more insistently, and he reached for the canvas. Margaret caught his hand and redirected it toward the toast rack. "Mrs. Hewitt will take you upstairs for breakfast," she said. And she lifted William down and handed him to the nurse, who curtsied and carried him out without a word. The door closed. Margaret sat alone in the morning room with the portrait face down on the table and the April light coming through the window at the angle that had always been wrong for this room because the architect had prioritized symmetry over illumination. She stood and left the room without clearing the table. She walked through the entrance hall and up the main staircase to the second floor, then up the narrower servants' stair to the third floor where the attic rooms were located. The attic had not been opened in 4 years. Margaret pushed the door and it resisted, the hinges stiff, and she put her shoulder to the wood until it gave. The air inside was cold and still, and dust moved in the shaft of light that came through the small window at the far end of the room. Against the wall, wrapped in linen and stacked with care, were the canvases and brushes and pigments her father had left her when he died. Thomas Farrow's tools. Margaret had not touched them since the week she married Richard. She knelt beside the stack and unwrapped the linen, and the smell of linseed oil rose sharp and immediate, cutting through the dust. She carried the canvases down to the bedroom and set them against the wall in the corner where the light from the window was strongest. She went back for the brushes, the pigments, the small wooden case that held her father's palette knives. She set up the easel her father had built for her when she was 16, the one she had used in his studio on Cheney Walk when he was teaching her to see the way a painter sees. She positioned the easel by the window and adjusted the angle until the light fell cleanly across the canvas. Then she went back downstairs to the morning room and retrieved the portrait of Richard and Serena Drake. She carried it upstairs and propped it against the chair opposite the easel. Margaret did not sit. She stood before the easel with a blank canvas mounted and a brush in her hand, and she studied the portrait Heywood had painted. She studied Serena Drake, not the pose, not the gown, the woman, the line of her jaw, the way her hand rested on Richard's shoulder with just enough pressure to suggest familiarity, but not enough to suggest claim. The faint tightness around her eyes that Heywood had either failed to see or chosen to soften. The way her mouth was set in a controlled half-smile that did not reach her expression. Margaret saw through the composition to the woman beneath it, the way her father had taught her to see through any sitter's performance to the truth of what they carried. She began to paint. She worked through the afternoon without stopping, without eating, without acknowledging the knock at the door when the maid came to ask if she required tea. She painted Serena Drake the way Serena Drake actually was, not the way Heywood had rendered her. She painted the calculation in the set of her shoulders. She painted the effort it took to hold that smile. She painted the vulnerability in the way her fingers curved against Richard's chair and as though she needed the contact to anchor herself. She painted every line of ambition and loneliness and determination, every mark of a woman who had chosen a path and was walking it with her eyes open. She did not soften. She did not exaggerate. She rendered what she saw with the precision and honesty her father had drilled into her from the time she was 6 years old and first held a brush. The light faded. Margaret lit the lamps and kept working. The house grew quiet around her. Richard did not come home for dinner. Margaret did not notice. She worked through the night, adjusting the lamp position twice to maintain the angle of illumination, stepping back every 20 minutes to assess the composition from a distance. By 3 a.m, the portrait was nearly finished. By 6, or as the first light began to come through the window, Margaret set down her brush and stepped back. The portrait of Serena Drake looked back at her from the canvas. Not cruel, not kind, true. Every line of effort, every calculation, every flicker of vulnerability rendered with clinical honesty. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, but her beauty was complicated by everything else the painting revealed. It was the finest portrait Margaret had painted in 4 years. It was the first portrait she had painted since her wedding. She signed it in the lower right corner, the way her father had taught her to sign her work. M. Farrow. Margaret wrapped the portrait in clean linen and tied it with string. She wrote the address on the outside in her own hand. Lady Serena Drake, Cavendish Square. She did not include a note. She carried the parcel downstairs and left it on the hall table for the footman to take to the post. Then she went back upstairs, lay down on the bed without undressing, and slept for 3 hours. Serena Drake received the parcel 2 days later. It arrived in the late afternoon, carried in by her housekeeper with the rest of the day's correspondence, and Serena set it aside while she finished her tea. She assumed it was a response, some form of retaliation, perhaps a letter, perhaps something more theatrical. When she finally opened it, she expected tears or fury rendered in ink. What she found instead was a portrait of herself. Serena stared at the canvas. She recognized her own face, her own posture, the gown she had worn for the sitting with Haywood. But this was not Haywood's work. This was something else entirely. And the brushwork was finer, more controlled, and the composition had been reimagined. She was no longer standing behind Richard. She was alone, centered, fully visible, and she was rendered with a level of honesty that made her breath catch. The woman in the portrait was not the woman Haywood had painted. Haywood had given her elegance and poise. This portrait gave her truth. Every line of effort in her expression, every trace of ambition and loneliness and determination, every flicker of vulnerability she had worked so hard to conceal. It was all there, captured with a precision that felt almost surgical. The portrait was beautiful. It was also devastating. Serena could not look away from it, and she could not display it. Because to display it would be to admit that this was who she actually was beneath the performance. Yet she turned the canvas over and found the signature in the lower right corner. M. Farrow. Serena sat with the portrait for an hour, studying it the way one studies a mirror that reveals more than expected. Then she wrapped it again and carried it to Lady Penrose's salon that evening, where the usual gathering of artists and patrons convened on Thursday nights. She unwrapped the portrait in the center of the room and set it on the easel Lady Penrose kept by the window. Serena said, "This was painted by the Duchess of Ashworth." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "She painted me from the portrait I commissioned. She has never seen my face." The room went quiet. Lady Penrose approached the easel and studied the portrait for a long moment, then turned to Serena with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and disbelief. "She painted this without sitting you?" Serena replied, "She painted it from the portrait Haywood did of the Duke and myself. I sent it to her. She sent this back." Sir Edmund Lawrence, president of the Royal Academy, rose from his chair by the fire and crossed the room. He was a man in his 60s, gray-haired and precise, with a reputation for exacting standards and an eye that could assess a painting's technical merit in under a minute. He stood before the portrait of Serena and studied it in silence. Then he leaned closer, examining the brushwork, the layering of pigment, the control of light and shadow. Sir Edmund said finally, "This is Academy quality work." He straightened and turned to Serena. "Farrow had a successor." Lady Penrose said, "The Duchess, Thomas Farrow's daughter." Sir Edmund replied, "I am aware of her lineage. I was not aware she still painted." He looked at Serena. "You sent her a portrait of yourself with her husband, and she responded with this?" Serena nodded. "Yes." Sir Edmund turned back to the portrait. "She did not humiliate you. She saw you. That is worse." He paused, then looked at Serena again. "And also better." Sir Edmund called on Margaret the following week. He arrived at the Ashworth townhouse in the late morning and was shown into the drawing room, where Margaret received him with the formal courtesy expected of a duchess. She offered tea. He declined. He came directly to the point. Sir Edmund said, "Lady Drake showed me the portrait you painted. It is the finest work I have seen from an emerging artist in a decade. I would like you to submit to the summer exhibition." Margaret's hand stilled in her lap. "For the summer exhibition." He confirmed, "At Somerset House. The submission deadline is 6 weeks from now. I will provide you with the guidelines." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he set on the table between them. "You are Thomas Farrow's successor, Lady Ashworth. It is time the Academy recognized that." Margaret took the document, but did not unfold it. "Thank you, Sir Edmund." Sir Edmund said, "I expect to see your work on the wall in June." He rose, bowed, and left the room. Margaret sat alone with the document in her hands. She unfolded it and read through the submission guidelines, her eyes moving down the page until they reached the section on naming conventions. She read the paragraph once, then read it again. All artists submitting to the summer exhibition must provide their full legal name as it appears on official documents. Married women must submit under their husband's full title. Maiden names are insufficient and will result in rejection of the submission. Margaret set the document down and stared at the words. She read them a third time, slowly, as though reading them more carefully might change what they said. Then she rose and went to Richard's study. She found the cabinet where he kept the records of his committee work and opened the drawer labeled Royal Academy. She pulled out the file for the most recent meeting and paged through the minutes until she found the entry dated 6 weeks prior. Motion moved by the Duke of Ashworth, that the exhibition committee adopt a policy requiring full legal names on all submissions. In the interest of transparency and accountability. Motion carried unanimously. Margaret read the line 3 times. Then she read the paragraph that followed, which detailed the rationale Richard had provided for the motion. It is the responsibility of the Academy to ensure that all artists exhibiting under our auspices do so under names that reflect their legal standing and social position. This policy ensures clarity and prevents confusion. Margaret closed the file and returned it to the drawer. She walked back to the morning room and sat in the chair by the window where the light came in at the wrong angle. She held the committee minutes in her lap and read the line in Richard's handwriting again, moved by the Duke of Ashworth. She sat with the document for an hour, reading the same line over and over, understanding with perfect clarity that her husband had voted to erase the name she signed her work with, and he had done it without once considering that it would matter to anyone. Richard came home late that evening. He went directly to the library, as he always did when he returned from a long day at Westminster, and he poured himself a glass of whiskey before sitting down at his desk. Margaret was already there, standing by the window with the committee minutes in her hand. Richard looked up and saw her. He set down his glass. "Margaret?" She crossed the room and placed the committee minutes on his desk. "You moved the motion." Richard glanced down at the document, then back at her. "What motion?" Margaret said, "The naming policy for the summer exhibition. You moved the motion that requires married women to submit under their husband's title. You did it 6 weeks ago." Richard's expression shifted. He picked up the document and scanned it, then set it down again. "The policy ensures accountability. Artists should exhibit under their legal names." Margaret said, "The policy ensures that Margaret Farrow does not exist. If I submit as the Duchess of Ashworth, the world credits you. If I submit as Margaret Farrow, the committee you chair rejects it. You built a system in which my name does not exist. And you did it 6 weeks ago without thinking for a single moment that it would cost anyone." Richard stood. "That was not the intent of the policy." Margaret replied, "I know. That is what makes it worse. You did not do this deliberately. You did it without thinking. My name was not worth a thought. The name I sign my work with, the name my father taught me to sign with, the name that connects me to every painting I have ever made. It did not occur to you for a single moment that erasing it from the Academy's walls would matter to anyone in the room." Richard's jaw tightened. "The policy applies to all married women, not only to you," Margaret said. "I am aware. That does not make it better. It makes it institutional. It means you voted to erase every woman whose legal name is absorbed into her husband's title, and you did it because it seemed principled, and you did not stop to examine who it costs." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do?" Margaret answered, "I want you to understand that you did this. I want you to sit with the fact that you moved the motion that prevents your own wife from exhibiting under the name she trained under. I want you to consider, for one moment, what it means that you voted for a rule that erases me without ever considering that I might be one of the women it erases. She turned and left the room. Richard stood at his desk with the committee minutes in his hand, and the sound of the door closing behind her. Richard went to Sir Edmund the next morning. He found him at the Royal Academy offices on Piccadilly and requested a private meeting. Sir Edmund received him in his study, a room lined with paintings and plaster casts, and gestured for Richard to sit. Richard said, "I need to propose an amendment to the naming policy." Sir Edmund raised an eyebrow. "But the policy the committee voted on 6 weeks ago." Richard confirmed, "Yes. The policy I moved. It prevents my wife from submitting to the summer exhibition under the name she trained under, Margaret Farrow, Thomas Farrow's successor. You saw her work. You called it Academy quality. She cannot submit under that name because the policy requires her to use my title. And if she uses my title, the credit attaches to me." Sir Edmund leaned back in his chair and studied Richard with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely unmoved. "The committee voted, Your Grace. The policy is procedurally sound." Richard said, "The policy erases women whose legal names are absorbed into their husbands' titles. It prevents them from exhibiting under the names they sign their work with. That was not the intent. But it is the effect." Sir Edmund replied, "The intent was to ensure transparency. The committee agreed. The vote was unanimous." Richard said, "I am asking you to reconsider." Sir Edmund said, "I am not the committee. If you wish to amend the policy, bring it to the next meeting. But I will tell you now, Your Grace, that the committee is unlikely to reverse a decision it made 6 weeks ago simply because the Duke of Ashworth has discovered that his own wife is affected by it." Richard stood. "Then I will bring it to the next meeting." Sir Edmund said, "You may, but the answer will be the same." The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth summoned Margaret to tea 3 days later. Margaret arrived at the Dowager's residence on Grosvenor Square at 4 o'clock and was shown into the drawing-room. It was where the Dowager sat in her usual chair by the fire. She did not rise when Margaret entered. She gestured to the chair opposite and poured the tea herself, a pointed reminder that this was not a social call. The Dowager said, "I understand you have been painting." Margaret accepted the tea and set it on the table beside her chair. "I have." The Dowager continued, "And that you intend to submit to the Royal Academy's summer exhibition." Margaret replied, "I do." The Dowager set down the teapot with more force than necessary. "You are a duchess, Margaret. Thomas Farrow was a craftsman, a very talented craftsman, but a craftsman nonetheless. You are not a tradeswoman. The distinction exists for a reason." Margaret said, "The distinction exists because men like Richard vote for it in committees, and women like you enforce it at dinner tables." The Dowager's expression hardened. "You are declaring yourself a tradeswoman. You are humiliating your husband and this family by insisting on a name that no longer applies to you. You married into this family. You are the Duchess of Ashworth. That is your name now." Margaret said, "Margaret Farrow is the name I sign my work with. It is the name my father taught me to sign with. It is the name that connects me to every painting I have ever made. I did not stop being a painter when I became a duchess. I stopped painting because every room in this house confirmed that a duchess does not create. But I am creating now, and I will sign my work with the name that belongs to the work, not the name that belongs to the title." The Dowager said, "Then you will not exhibit. The committee will not accept it." Margaret stood. "I know. Thank you for the tea." She left the Dowager's residence and walked directly to Cheyne Walk, where her father's studio still stood. The building had been closed since Thomas Farrow's death 3 years prior, but Margaret still held the key. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The studio smelled of dust and old linseed oil, and the light from the north-facing windows fell across the floor in clean, even lines. Margaret stood in the center of the room and felt something inside her chest unlock. She moved into the studio that afternoon, not leaving the marriage, not abandoning the townhouse or William or the life she had built, but reclaiming the space where the light was right and the architecture did not insist she stop. She brought the 3 canvases from her wardrobe and set them on easels. She unpacked her father's brushes and arranged them by size. She set up the work table and the pigment jars and the palette knives. She opened the windows and let the air move through the room. Richard found her there 2 days later. He arrived in the late afternoon and knocked on the studio door, and Margaret opened it without speaking. He stepped inside and looked around the room, taking in the easels, the canvases, the brushes laid out with the precision of a surgeon's tools. Margaret watched him absorb it, the fact that she was working openly, unapologetically, surrounded by the tools her father had left her. Margaret said, "Sit there," pointing to the chair by the window. "Don't move." Richard looked at her, then at the chair. He crossed the room and sat. Margaret positioned the chair so the light fell cleanly across his face, then adjusted the angle of his jaw with her fingers, tilting it slightly toward the window. Her touch was clinical, the authority of a painter directing a subject. Richard held still. She stepped back and studied him for a long moment, then picked up a brush and began to paint. She worked for 2 hours without speaking. Richard sat without moving, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his gaze fixed on the far wall. Margaret painted him the way she had painted Serena, not the performance, but the man beneath it. The line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the faint exhaustion around his eyes that he carried, but never named. She painted the man who had voted to erase her name without thinking, and she painted him with the same honesty she had brought to every portrait she had ever made. When she finally set down the brush, the light outside had shifted to the deep gold of late afternoon. Margaret stepped back from the canvas and wiped her hands on a cloth. Richard stood and crossed to the easel, and he looked at the portrait she had begun. He did not speak. Margaret sat on the floor by the window, her back against the wall, and Richard sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. He took her hand, not examining it, just holding it. The weight of institutional failure shared through a grip. Richard said, "The committee meets again in 2 weeks." Margaret replied, "I know." Richard said, "I am going to propose the amendment." Margaret said, "I know." They sat in silence as the light faded. That night, Richard stayed. At dawn, Margaret stood at the easel and studied the way the changing light fell across the canvas. Richard stood behind her, and she reached back without turning and rested her hand on the nape of his neck. Both in the composition, both staying. The Royal Academy Committee convened 2 weeks later in the meeting room on Piccadilly. Richard arrived early and took his seat at the long table where the committee members gathered. Sir Edmund sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other members: Lord Hastings, Mr. Pemberton, Sir Charles Wickliffe, and Mr. Aldridge. The agenda for the meeting was brief. Richard had submitted the amendment the week prior, and it was listed as the final item for discussion. The committee moved through the routine business quickly. Approval of exhibition placements, review of submitted works, the discussion of the opening ceremony. When they reached the final item, Sir Edmund looked down the table at Richard and nodded. Sir Edmund said, "Your Grace, you have proposed an amendment to the naming policy adopted 6 weeks ago. Please present your argument." Richard stood. He had prepared his remarks carefully, and he delivered them without notes. The policy we adopted requires artists to submit under their full legal names. For married women, this means submitting under their husband's title. The intent was transparency and accountability. The effect, however, is that women whose legal names are absorbed into their husband's titles cannot exhibit under the names they sign their work with. My own wife is one of those women. Margaret Farrow, daughter of Thomas Farrow, trained by her father from childhood. Sir Edmund has seen her work and called it academy quality. But she cannot submit under the name Margaret Farrow because the policy we voted for does not recognize that name as legally sufficient. She must submit as the Duchess of Ashworth, which means the credit attaches to my name, not hers. I am asking the committee to amend the policy to allow married women to submit under their maiden names in addition to their legal titles. Sir Edmund looked down the table. Discussion? Lord Hastings spoke first. The policy was adopted to ensure clarity. Allowing multiple names creates confusion. Richard said, "It creates accuracy. Margaret Farrow is the name she has signed her work with for 15 years. It is the name her father taught her to sign with. It is the name that connects her to her body of work. Requiring her to submit as the Duchess of Ashworth erases that connection." Mr. Pemberton leaned forward. "The policy applies equally to all married women. It is not targeted at any individual." Richard said, "That does not make it just. It makes it institutional. We voted to erase every woman whose legal name is absorbed into her husband's title, and we did it without considering what it costs. I am asking us to reconsider." Sir Charles Wickliffe shook his head. "The policy is procedurally sound," the committee voted. "Reversing it now sets a precedent that any policy can be overturned simply because one member has changed his mind." Richard said, "I have not changed my mind. I have discovered the cost of the decision I made. That is not the same thing." Sir Edmund raised a hand. "Enough. The amendment has been proposed. We will vote." He looked around the table. All in favor of amending the naming policy to allow married women to submit under their maiden names in addition to their legal titles? Richard raised his hand. No one else moved. Sir Edmund said, "All opposed?" 4 hands rose. Sir Edmund set down his pen. "The amendment fails. The policy stands." Richard stood in the corridor outside the meeting room afterward, his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. The door opened, and Margaret stepped into the corridor. She'd been waiting on the bench by the window. Richard looked up and saw her. He said, "It failed." Margaret replied, "I know." Richard said, "I was the only vote in favor." Margaret said, "I know." Richard crossed the corridor and stood before her. "I will resign from the committee." Margaret said, "That changes nothing for the next woman. You must keep the seat and keep voting until it does." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Margaret submitted to the summer exhibition 3 weeks later. She carried the submission parcel to the Royal Academy offices herself and handed it to the clerk at the desk. The clerk opened the parcel and removed the canvas, a self-portrait Margaret had painted in the studio on Cheney Walk. Margaret as painter, smock, brushes, direct gaze. Not a duchess performing art, an artist who happened to be a duchess. The clerk examined the canvas, then looked at the submission form. He read the name Margaret had written in the space for the artist's legal name. He read it twice and then looked up at her. The clerk said, "Margaret Farrow, Duchess of Ashworth." Margaret confirmed, "Yes." The clerk hesitated. "The policy requires full legal titles for married women." Margaret said, "The Duchess of Ashworth is my full legal title. Margaret Farrow is the name I sign my work with. I have provided both. The policy does not prohibit that formulation." The clerk looked at the form again, then at the canvas. He set both on the desk and went to the back office. Margaret waited. 5 minutes passed. The clerk returned with Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund looked at the submission form, then at the canvas. He studied the self-portrait for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Margaret. Sir Edmund said, "This is procedurally acceptable." Margaret inclined her head. "Thank you, Sir Edmund." Sir Edmund said, "I will see you at the opening." He handed the form back to the clerk and returned to his office. The clerk stamped the form and entered the submission into the ledger. Margaret left the building and walked back to Cheney Walk. She did not go to the townhouse. She went to the studio and picked up a brush and kept working. The summer exhibition opened in June. Somerset House was filled with paintings hung floor to ceiling, and the crowd moved through the rooms in a slow tide of silk and conversation. Margaret arrived with Richard in the late afternoon, and they entered through the main hall where the largest works were displayed. Margaret wore a gown of deep blue silk, simple and elegant, and she carried herself with the posture of a woman who had earned her place on these walls. They found the self-portrait in the third room. It hung at eye level, centered on the wall between two landscapes, and the placard beneath it read, "Self-portrait, Margaret Farrow, Duchess of Ashworth." Margaret stood before the painting and studied it the way she would study any work, assessing the composition, the brushwork, the control of light. Richard stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at the painting his wife had made while he sat on the committee that had tried to keep it off this wall. Richard said quietly, "You painted yourself as you are." Margaret replied, "I did." Richard said, "Not as a duchess." Margaret said, "As a painter who is also a duchess. Both are true." A woman's voice spoke from behind them. "It is an extraordinary work." Margaret turned. Serena Drake stood 3 paces away, dressed in pale gray silk, her expression composed but not cold. She looked at the self-portrait, then at Margaret. Serena said, "You painted me more honestly than anyone ever has. I sent you a provocation. You sent me back a mirror. That was worse." She paused, and it was better. Margaret inclined her head. "The portrait of you hangs 3 rooms away." Serena replied, "I know. I have seen it." She looked at Richard. "Your Grace." Richard met her gaze. "Lady Drake." Serena turned back to Margaret. "I came to tell you that I have kept the portrait you painted. I will not display it, but I will not destroy it either." She paused. "It is the only portrait of me that tells the truth." She inclined her head and walked away. Margaret watched her go, then turned back to the self-portrait. Richard stood beside her in silence. Richard said finally, "I voted to keep your name off this wall. I moved the motion. I did it 6 weeks before you sent that portrait to Lady Drake. And I did it without considering for a single moment that it would matter to anyone in this room. That is not cruelty. It is something I do not have a word for." Margaret said, "The word is institutional. It means harm done by people who do not notice they are doing it." Richard looked at her. "How do I stop doing it?" Margaret said, "You keep voting. You keep the seat. You keep proposing the amendment. You make them say no until they stop saying no." Richard nodded slowly. They stood together before the self-portrait as the crowd moved past them. And for the first time in 4 years, Margaret felt the weight of invisibility lift. The morning room was the same as it had been in April. The same light came through the window at the same wrong angle, but Margaret had repositioned the furniture so the easel stood where the light fell cleanest. The commissioned portrait of Richard and Serena was gone. In its place, on the wall above the mantel, hung Margaret's self-portrait, brought home from the exhibition after the closing ceremony. Margaret worked at the easel 3 mornings a week now, painting commissions and studies and portraits of William, who sat with surprising patience for a child of 2. Richard read in the chair by the window while she worked, and he had learned not to speak unless spoken to. The discipline of a man learning that the room belonged to her work, not to his presence. William sat on the floor with a sheet of paper and a handful of Margaret's pencils, drawing scribbles that he insisted were horses. And Margaret finished the portrait she was working on and set down her brush. She wiped her hands on a cloth and crossed to where William sat. She picked up the drawing he had just finished, a tangle of lines in red and blue, and studied it with the same attention she gave to any composition. Margaret asked, "May I hang this?" William looked up at her and nodded solemnly. "Horse." Margaret carried the drawing to the wall beside her easel and pinned it next to the canvas she had just completed. Richard looked up from his book and watched her. Richard said, "You have hung his drawing next to yours." Margaret replied, "He drew it. Work deserves a wall." Richard set down his book and crossed to where she stood. He looked at William's drawing, then at the portrait beside it. "That is the principle?" Margaret said. "That is the principle. All work deserves a wall. It does not matter whether the artist is 2 or 28. It does not matter whether the artist is a duchess or a duke or a widow or a child. If the work is made, it deserves to be seen." Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The committee meets again next week. I am resubmitting the amendment." Margaret replied, "I know." Richard said, "It will fail again." Margaret said, "Probably, but you will keep submitting it." Richard confirmed, "I will." Margaret picked up her brush and returned to the easel. Richard returned to his chair by the window. William continued drawing. The morning light moved across the floor, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the brush against canvas and the scratch of pencil on paper. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Royal Academy. Margaret opened it in the studio on Cheney Walk, where she had been working since dawn. She read the letter once, then set it down on the work table and picked up her brush. She did not stop working. The celebration was the work itself. Richard arrived an hour later with tea. He set the tray on the table and saw the letter. He picked it up and read it. Richard said, "The amendment passed." Margaret replied, "I know. I received the letter an hour ago." Richard said, "You did not mention it." Margaret said, "I was painting." Richard set down the letter and looked at her. She stood at the easel with a brush in her hand, her smock streaked with cadmium yellow and burnt umber, her hair pinned back with the same carelessness she had always worn when she worked. For the first time in 4 years, he saw what her father had seen, not a duchess, not a painter's daughter, but a painter. The work itself, visible, signed. Richard said, "The letter says the amendment passed because 3 other committee members' wives submitted under dual names following your precedent. You invented the formulation. It became the standard." Margaret dipped her brush in the pigment and returned to the canvas. "Then the next woman will not have to invent it." Richard watched her work. The studio smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, and the light from the north-facing windows fell across the floor in clean, even lines. Margaret painted in silence, her hand moving with the precision and confidence her father had trained into her from the time she was 6 years old. Richard sat in the chair by the window and did not speak. He had learned, finally, that the room belonged to her work. And that was enough.